How's it going, everybody? So, people sometimes have difficulty understanding the idea that cities are inherently unsustainable. And a friend of mine wrote a long piece about this a while ago, and it's really interesting. I can send a link to people if they're interested, but the piece is basically about mapping the material resource flows of a city. And the way I define a city, the way that a lot of the people I work with define a city, is a group of people who are living in dense enough numbers in a certain area that they can't just survive off that land. They need to have things coming in from other areas. So for example, I grew up in Seattle. You go down and look at the port of Seattle, and what you see is a huge number of container ships coming in, bulk commodity ships coming in with grain and oil and all kinds of stuff, timber, food, cars, the bulk commodities that allow modern civilization to exist. Also things that you wouldn't expect so much, like gypsum and coking coal and other shit like that. And this has been the way that cities have functioned since the very first cities. You look back, there's even a term from the days of the Italian city-states. The term is Kant Otto. And Kant Otto means the area from which a city draws its resources. So it's not actually urbanized, but it's controlled and exploited by the city. And so if you think of that, there's the physical boundary of the city, and then there's the area that it exploits, that it draws from. And that's much, much, much larger. So you look at the situation we're in today, and the only way you can have communities with 100,000, 500,000, 10 million people living in one place is by shipping them massive amounts of resources from all around the world. And, of course, we live in a globalized society, but the same thing is true when you look back at, civilizations and cities in history before industrialism, whether you're talking about, ancient Rome or the cities in Mesopotamia or what have you, all these places, and there are some great sources that I could point you towards talking about how, for example, Northern Africa was completely decimated in order to produce grain to feed Rome and the rest of the big cities of the Roman Empire. So this is what they do. They exploit the land and they feed these centers of power. And years ago, I was living in Washington, and I pinned a little note above my door, and the note said, "This is a reminder." It was a reminder to myself, and it said something like, "When you walk out this door, you're entering a work camp." And I think that's a great way for us to look at cities, is work camps. People generally don't. The first generation people who move to live in cities generally don't want to live there. You can see this in a lot of places around the world. West Africa, Nigeria, all across India, parts of China, although it's past in a lot of areas of China. These areas that are rapidly urbanizing, what you see is extremely poor people who have been forced off their land by privatization, by increased taxes, by low prices for their goods that they were producing via small scale farming or what have you. And so people are forced essentially to move into the cities, and that's how cities grow for the most part, is as sources of labor, concentrated labor. And that's why you see major corporations, their headquarters and so on, they're always located in cities, major cities, because cities provide the amount of surplus labor that allows them to keep the wages low and allows them to harness the population and put them to work. So I think there are plenty of people who like living in cities. I grew up in Seattle. There are aspects of city life that I like. I live out in the country now, and I love it a lot more. But I think that a lot of that is the influence of colonization. We've been trained to enjoy living in these cities. And, that's no doubt. I love going to Seattle and going out to my favorite restaurant, and, my family's all there and all that stuff. But increasingly, my favorite things are, the people there and some of the experiences. But, we're not meant to live that way. We're not meant to live jam-packed all together on the land like that, completely divorced from anything. I mean, you look at a city like Seattle, for example, and that whole city used to be covered in old-growth forest. Trees 400 feet tall and 2,000 years old. And now you can't find one of those trees left across hundreds of square miles of that area. And the metropolis just, extends far, far to the north and south. And what you have in its place is essentially a monument or an edifice to destruction of the natural world. You have houses that are made of those forests. You have roads that are made of asphalt, which is oil. It's a fossil fuel, bitumen. You have massive infrastructure. You have freeways cutting through everything. You have this major port. You have rail lines. You have factories. You have business interests. And you have the residential areas, which are where the labor force resides. So, most people don't realize, another example is skyscrapers. Skyscrapers are essentially made out of sand. And sand mining worldwide is an extremely destructive industry. After water, sand is the most used, quote-unquote, resource in the world. This culture consumes prodigious quantities of sand and extracts it through strip mining, basically. So, they cut down all the trees, they remove all the plants, they destroy all the plants, they bulldoze them, whatever. Any animals that live there are either crushed and killed, or their food sources removed and they're moved out of there, likely to die of starvation or getting hit by cars or what have you. And they mine all the sand. And, that's the main component in concrete, for example, which is what all these skyscrapers are made of. So it's not an exaggeration to say that cities are literally made up of the blood and bones of the natural world. They're sort of necropolises by their very nature. So, that said, cities are good places to organize. You have concentrated people, but, a lot of those people, cities do something to our minds. They don't make us well. And I think a big reason for that is just because when you're surrounded by human creations all the time, every minute of every day is mediated by human creations of one sort or another, whether that's, technological or architectural or cultural or what have you. And that does something to us, just when we're not exposed and, in relationship with the natural world. It's so far from how we're meant to live, breathing fresh air and walking on the earth and smelling the smells of the natural world and seeing the birds fly around us and the creatures move through and drinking the water from the streams and rivers and springs and, eating our food from the land rather than going into grocery stores and buying these, toxic mimics of real food. It's no wonder that this culture is so sick. This urbanized culture is so unhealthy. And so, in that sense, a city is a hard place to organize, and it's a hard place to get people to understand what exactly the city does and how it functions. So, I had to travel this past weekend to a Deep Green Resistance gathering, and it was phenomenal. The people who I work with in that organization are absolutely incredible. Some of there's a squirrel going by out there. Squirrel family lives in these trees up here, and we see them all the time. We had this gathering, just an incredible group of people working on, a bunch of different campaigns all across the region, and I had to travel through Salt Lake City. I had to go into the airport and fly, and it's just insane. It's insane, and it's become so normalized to be surrounded by, the fruits of this culture, which are death, essentially. It's, the destroyed world. the artifacts of this culture. And I think it's something that we really need to come to grips with, because in the modern environmental movement, there's become this big focus on green urbanism and dense cities and packing people together to reduce their energy usage and so on, and reduce the amount of transportation people have to use so they can walk everywhere, and small walkable neighborhoods and so on. And this is actually bullshit. It's not actually supported by the evidence. If you look into the actual scientific literature that looks at, do people actually use less energy for things like transportation when they live in a dense city versus in suburban areas or rural areas, the answer is actually no. They don't use less energy. So this is an imaginary idea that's being perpetuated, and it's being pushed by huge entities. The UN has a whole green cities program. There's a group called I think it's called the C40 or something like that. It was originally 40 mega cities that were collaborating on green urbanism together, and it's expanded much beyond that now. Almost every major city has some sort of sustainability urban planning department, and they're doubling down on this type of stuff, and a lot of people are eating it up. And the reality is it's a model that has no future. Cities are not going to work as a way for human beings to live on this planet. And there are a lot of reasons for that beyond what I've talked about here, and we're going to be exploring some of them. If you don't know, I'm working on a book collaborating with Derek Jensen and Lair Keith. The tentative title is Bright Green Lies, and we're finishing up the first draft of it here, so it'll be published sometime in the next year. And we're going to address this issue in depth, and also look at a lot of other things like green technology, wind, solar, electric cars, rail travel, all this stuff, these sort of mainstream mythologies that underlie so much of the movement. And we're going to debunk them systematically. Not with the goal of shutting people down or making people angry or anything like that, but because these false solutions are dangerous. They cause us to spend our energy and our time doing things that aren't going to work. And we need to avoid that, because time's short and we've got to get a lot of things done.